In the U.S., we have a $100 bill. That's our largest denomination. When I was a teenager, the U.S. had a $500 bill, and they were in circulation. You could get them. So they eliminated that in 1968. No more $500 bill, and from then on, the $100 bill was the largest denomination. But the difference between then and now is that in 1968, a $100 bill was worth $100. If you adjust for inflation, the $100 bill of 1968 is worth about $20 in purchasing power in today's money. So we're already at a point where our largest denomination is worth $20 in purchasing power, at least compared to the 60s, $100 nominally, but it's greatly shrunk. So we don't have much cash. And by the way, if you want $1 million in $100 bills, it weighs exactly 22 pounds, and it fits in an attaché case, $1 million in $100 bills. People look at me funny, they go, Jim, how come you know that? Well, first of all, I do know that, but it's really just a math problem, because one bill, whether it's a 1 or 100, but I'm using hundreds because the biggest, weighs a gram. So, it's basically, 10 grams or, 10 kilograms, 10 kilos, or 22.2 pounds. The point being, we're very far down the road to get them into cash anyway, but you can still do it. You can get your 22 pounds and have your $1 million in cash. So why are they so driven to eliminate cash? What's that got to do with central bank digital currency? Well, now we get into the purpose of the central bank digital currency. And the metaphor I've used is that if you want to slaughter pigs, you have to get all the pigs into a cattle chute and run them into the slaughterhouse and then slaughter them. You can't just let them, run around. You got to herd them up and get them into a cattle chute, or cows for that matter. And so if they want to slaughter savers and investors, they have to get you into a digital slaughterhouse. And that's what digital money is all about. If you can't have cash and you can only have the central bank digital currency, then everyone's got to have a digital account. And once they've got you in the system, of course, they know who you are because it's all digital, and they keep the ledger. Back to the ledger. What can they do? Well, they can impose negative interest rates. So you have $100,000 at 1% interest. You go away for a year, you come back, you should have $101,000. But with a negative interest rate of 1%, you go away, come back in a year, and you'd have $99,000. Well, cash is an easy way around that. At least you can bury it in your backyard, but at least you'd have the $100,000 in my example a year later. But with a digital account, they can actually take it out of your account. Number one. Number two, they can put a timestamp or an expiration date on your money and say, okay, here's your money that's in your account, but if you don't spend 10% of it in the next 30 days, we're going to impose a 2% penalty. We're going to take it away basically if you don't spend it. Oh, what does that do? It kind of forces you to spend it. Is that a kind of stimulus? Maybe, I'm not sure. These things don't usually work out as the eggheads plan, but the idea would be if we don't have enough what Keynes called aggregate demand, we'll force people to go buy stuff by telling them if you don't spend it, you lose it. Use it or lose it kind of thing. Okay. Withholding taxes. Now, again, in the United States, I think it's similar in Australia. If you have a job, quote unquote, your regular payday, whatever, they pay you, but they deduct the withholding tax at the source, and it's based on the rate. So maybe it's, 20%. So you make $1,000, they take out $200, and here's the $800 net to you. And then at the end of the year, they give you a statement, and you file your tax return, and you claim the withholding, and you reconcile your taxes. But that's not true for independent contractors, doctors, lawyers, professionals, writers, anyone who you earn a living, you work, right? But you don't have any withholding tax, but you still have the money still goes in your bank account. Well, now they can just impose the tax on your bank account. Say, well, hey, we see your inflows here. You make a nice living. We're going to take 20% of that. Again, we'll send you a receipt, tax receipt, and file your tax return and sort it out at the end of the year. That would come as a shock to a lot of doctors and lawyers. So negative interest rates and withholding taxes are two things that are hard to impose if in a world of cash and non-central bank digital currencies, but they're easy in a world of no cash and central bank digital currencies. Well, it gets worse. This is the culmination, just kind of cut to the chase. This is the culmination of the total surveillance state. We already have facial recognition software, very good. It's like your face is like a fingerprint. Everyone's a little different. You say, well, that's okay. I'm going to put a mask on because COVID, and sunglasses, and pull a hat down to my forehead. You'll never see my face. You know what? They have gait recognition software, GAIT, meaning how you walk. Everybody walks differently. It was the Monty Python thing, the mystery of silly walks? Well, silly or not, everybody walks differently. And so they can actually digitally identify you just by the way you walk. And so your mask isn't going to help you. And with GPS, I have a bunch of what are called Faraday sacks. They're, some of them are nice, they're leather wallets, but they're basically lined with a certain metallic fibers that block radiation. So if you want to turn your cell phone off, put it in a Faraday sack, and by the way, do the same with your Easy Pass and any other things sending out radiation, which are ubiquitous. Maybe they can't follow you around, but most people don't do that, and they do. And so with your iPhone, they know where you are at all times. You may be looking at a map trying to find a good restaurant, but they're tracking you. So they already do that. But now they take it a step further. So you're at the point of purchase, you're buying a book. Let's say it's a book that criticizes Kevin Rudd, for example. He's your leading panda hugger down in Australia, or in the United States, criticizes Joe Biden or something, or, Ultra MAGA handbook or whatever it is. Well, Ultra MAGA, you're an extremist, you're a radical, you're part of the insurrection. So now we're going to freeze your account or deny the purchase or put you on a watch list, or we just appropriated money to hire 87,000 armed IRS, Internal Revenue Service agents. Maybe we'll assign one to you because you bought the wrong book. So now we're into thought control. We're into basically subduing your political enemies, because well, if you give money to a certain political candidate, again, perfectly legal stuff, buy a book, make a donation, that's legal. But they don't like who you're doing it with. And they meaning the government, they're watching. They know what you're reading, and by inference, what you're thinking, who you're giving money to, what causes you support, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't take much these days to have some, kind of low IQ spokesperson at the White House label you as an extremist. So this is all government's ever wanted, was total control of the people. Makes Louis the 14th look like a very hands-off kind of guy.
But Jim, the government would never do these things. The tax office would never target a political group. They would never target a group of people because of donations to different causes. They would never target protesters in any way. They would never target someone who's doesn't want to get vaccinated in any way. None of these things would ever happen.
Well, I know you're being actually very serious, but I know that's more rhetorical. The fact is, not only will they happen, they have happened, they are happening. This is the world we live in. That's absolutely the case. And let me give some concrete examples, because I don't put stuff like that out there without backing up. So in 2010, the IRS targeted what we call in the United States the Tea Party movement. This was the first midterm of President Obama's first term in office. Historically, a time when the president's party loses a lot of seats. It's not even Democrats versus Republicans. It's just a consistent pattern of first term president, first midterm election, they lose seats. Obama lost almost a record number of seats, something like 63 or 64 seats versus an historical average closer to 30. Because of people were upset about Obamacare, they were upset about the tax increases, the bailouts coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis favored the rich, hurt the poor. There was just a lot of people were having second thoughts about voting for Obama in the first place. So we had this Tea Party movement, and they just kicked butt in the 2010 election. Well, so these were springing up everywhere. This was a genuine grassroots movement. There was no nationwide top-down organization. Communities were like, hey, let's start our own branch of the Tea Party, et cetera. And because they qualified as nonprofit organizations, there's some rules around that, but you have to apply to the IRS, our Internal Revenue Service, for a designation and a number proving that you're a nonprofit organization. Well, the person in charge of those was slow rolling all the applications. They weren't getting approved. They were entitled to it. That the IRS intervened to squash the formation of Tea Party movements from coast to coast for political reasons, plain and simple. Well, that was 12 years ago, and there was no central bank digital currency. Imagine how much more powerful that kind of corruption is today.
There were $1 trillion of subprime mortgages. These are mortgages that, no documentation, don't have to prove your income, very non-credit worthy. But there was a bubble mentality, a frenzy, and everyone, hey, buy a house and borrow money, fix it up, sell it for twice as much, walk away rich, and everybody was doing it. Mortgage default rates rarely get above 5%. 5% is really high in the mortgage market. So people were saying, smart people like Ben Stein, the financial analyst, but the central bank and others were like, well, okay, let's get crazy. Let's assume a 20% default rate, which has never happened, but just assume that's true. On $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, a 20% default rate would be a $200 billion loss, which was only slightly higher than the S&L crisis of the 1980s. Adjusted for inflation, it would have been a comparable loss. And the attitude was, well, we survived the 80s, we'll survive this. Yeah, it's bad, banks will take losses, stock prices go down a little bit, but we'll survive. What they missed is, yes, there was $1 trillion of subprime mortgages, but there were $6 trillion of derivatives. Yeah. That was invisible. So all of a sudden, 20% of that was $1.2 trillion. So you create derivatives out of thin air, and there's no limit on how many you can have. They're off balance sheet, meaning give me the balance sheet of the company, I won't see them. You have to read the footnotes and then the information behind the footnotes. So non-transparent, unregulated, no limit on size. So the crisis was actually much worse than anyone realized. And then when it started to collapse, the contagion spread throughout the financial system. My point about 2008, it was because we did not learn the lessons of 1998, and we flew right into 2008. But once again, we have not learned the lessons of 2008, and we're going to fly right into the next storm. In 1998, Wall Street got together and bailed out a hedge fund. In 2008, the central banks got together and bailed out Wall Street. Who's going to bail out the central banks? In other words, the point is each crisis is bigger than the one before. The intervention gets elevated, larger dollar amounts. And are we now at the point where there's no one left to bail us out? And one of the questions I'm asked most frequently is, okay, Jim, I kind of follow your analysis on how risk works and how complexity theory and capital markets, how that works. But where's the crisis coming from? What's going to be the catalyst? It's actually a long list. Now, student loans, there are $1.6 trillion worth of student loans. So this will go, and kind of this gets to your point, Francis, how do capital markets and money markets and Fed policy kind of leach into debt and deficits? So when a lender, credit union, or anybody, or university makes a loan to a student, and the Treasury guarantees that loan, which they do, it's off budget. Again, it's not strictly a derivative, but it is non-transparent. So then the student defaults, and the credit union, the lender, simply turns to the Treasury and said, here's your loan file, pay me. And the Treasury pays the lender because they've guaranteed the loan. Now it's on the Treasury. But until that point, that loss is not on the books of the United States government. That loss is not part of the deficit. But when the Treasury writes the check to make good on the guarantee, it does go into the deficit. So we think deficits are high now, but there's this $1 trillion tsunami of student loan losses that's going to pile on top of the structural deficits and make it even worse. So all these things are, I spend all my time analyzing these things. I see them all. I can describe them. I can see how they're going to converge into a worse crisis. But in the short run, people either ignore them or they just don't know anything about them. But why would Bernie Sanders even suggest that? And by the way, he's not alone. I think the other candidates have, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, one way or another, have suggested that they would do something similar, that we need student loan relief, and that ends up going onto the budget and onto the taxpayers. But there's a school of economics, and I talked about this in chapter 5 of my book. It's called Modern Monetary Theory, MMT for short. Everyday viewers, everyday people to know anything about it, but more to the point, economists don't know anything about it. This is a new school of economics, if you want to think of it that way. So there is this modern monetary theory, but the leading scholar of modern monetary theory is a lady named Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor at the State University of New York. but she's the financial advisor to Bernie Sanders. What modern monetary theory says is that actually there's no limit on the amount you can spend. You can spend as much as you want, and the market will either buy the debt, or if they balk, the Fed will monetize the debt. So how much debt is there relative to the size of the economy? This is called the debt to GDP ratio, but the way it's a simple fraction you learn in the 5th grade. How much debt divided by the size of the economy? So in a simple example, if you had $5 trillion of debt and a $10 trillion economy, that fraction would be 1/2. So you would say the debt to GDP ratio is 1/2 or 50%. Today, the debt is larger than the economy. That ratio is over 100%. We have round numbers, about $23 trillion of debt and about a $22 trillion economy. So the ratio is about 105%, highest since World War II. That troubles me, it troubles other economists. But my friend Stephanie says, what's the problem? You could take it to 150%, 200%, 250%. By the way, that's where Japan is. Japan's at 250%. Greece is 175% or so. Italy's 135%. They're all still standing. Go to the Ginza, it looks like Times Square. So you don't see visible signs of stress. And here's the irony. Ben Bernanke would absolutely not agree with this theory, and he said so publicly. But Professor Kelton says to Bernanke, you proved our point. You were the one who took the Fed's balance sheet and quadrupled it from 800 billion to 4.5 trillion or so. You proved that you can print trillions of dollars of money without causing inflation, without causing high interest rates, without causing a run on the bank. So all we're saying is, you did it to prop up Jamie Dimon's bonus. We wanted to do it to forgive student loans. We may have different policy objectives, but the process is the same. What's the problem? Now, of all the things I've debated, for years I was dragged into Bitcoin versus gold debates, which I thought were silly. I mean, I don't like Bitcoin, I do like gold, but it's like fish versus bicycles. I mean, the debate never made sense to me, even though I did a lot of them. Of all the things I've had to rebut, this was actually the most difficult because it's superficially appealing. First of all, legally, it is true that the Fed can take their balance sheet as high as they want. There's no legal limit on the Fed's ability to print money. It is true that Japan has a much higher debt to GDP ratio, and they're still standing. It is true that the Treasury can borrow as much as they want, subject to periodic increases in the debt ceiling, which have never been denied. And the Fed can monetize the debt. So all the elements of the thesis are actually correct. So how do you refute it? And the answer is that legally it can be done. And if your goal is to print a lot of money and forgive student loans or give a guaranteed job or guaranteed basic income, whatever it is, in theory you could do that. But there is an invisible psychological boundary, and this is what the modern monetary theorists don't understand, and I don't think Ben Bernanke understands it. There comes a time when people wake up and they say, I don't know what's going on here. I don't have a PhD, but get me out of the dollar. It doesn't. And so I'll buy gold. I'll buy silver, land, oil, natural resources. I'll buy a new car. Buy a house. Get me out of the dollar into something tangible, because I no longer trust the monetary authorities. I no longer trust the Congress. I can't believe that you're going to spend this much money without ceiling, without limit, without causing inflation. My inflationary expectations will go up. And the way to deal with that is to buy hard assets, starting with gold, but not exclusively gold. There, as I say, land, real estate, natural resources. They're all good. They're all good substitutes. At that point, interest rates will skyrocket. All of a sudden, the bond market will have difficulty selling it. The president of the Congress could take away some of the Fed's independence. All of these assumptions could come crashing down very quickly, very unexpectedly, and that's the problem with the theory.
What's coming is a very severe recession. The monetary tightening on top of a world where growth is deaccelerating, inventories are sky high. The funny thing about the supply chain, we all remember headline, supply chain's broken down, the shelves are bare. So all true, that was happening at the time. And that's when I started working on the book. But what a lot of purchasing managers did, and inventory managers, they doubled their orders. They said, or tripled the orders. They said, if the supply chain's breaking down and I want just a normal amount, I better order 3 times as much or twice as much just to get what I want. And they did. Well, what happened was by the summer, some of that pressure had been alleviated, and here come the shipments into the warehouses that are twice as much or 3 times as much as what you needed at the exact same time that the Fed was destroying demand. And so demand drops off a cliff, retail sales drop off a cliff, the warehouses go from being empty to being full to the rafters, and now all that merchandise is sitting there. So, Nike, I mean, just many examples. So what do you do when you're in charge of inventory? You cut prices. You don't want that inventory. It costs a lot of money to keep it in the warehouses, number one. Number two, a lot of it's seasonal. It's like, who wants to buy, a summer dress in December? Not too many people. So they just slash prices, and that reduces margins and reduces profits. So we're just kind of flying into the face of all that. With the Fed tightening rates into weakness. The Fed will be the last to know because they're very model driven and the models are badly flawed, mostly with the Phillips curve and their focus on the unemployment rate, which is not a good measure of what's going on in the labor force. So we're flying into a really bad recession. But you've got this pivot narrative you can't quite get rid of. Some of the buy the dips people are still around, so count on them to buy into what could be a horrendous bear market. You got your buy and hold crowd. Remember in 2000, 2001, the NASDAQ dropped 80%. And a lot of people got out, but they said, well, just hold on to it. Well, it did come back, but it took until 2015. I mean, that's a long time. A lot of people died in the meantime. You're waiting 14 years to get back to where you were. So those people are still around, but there is what I call the pivot crowd. So the Fed pivot is a narrative, and it kind of goes like this. Yeah, the Fed's tightening. We see that. Inflation is going to come down really fast. The economy is going to slow down really fast. Both of those things are happening. Inflation, a little less so, but the economic slowdown is there. And the Fed's going to get the wake-up call and have to cut rates. And cutting rates, that's the pivot. They're going to pivot from rate hikes to rate cuts. And that's good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. Now, that's the narrative. There are two huge fallacies in that narrative. The first one is who says the Fed's going to get the message? And if you look at what Jay Powell said and what he repeated, we're going to raise rates, we're going to crush inflation. I've been following this for 50 years. I've never seen a Fed chairman use the word pain 3 times in one paragraph, but he did, and he meant it. He knows there's going to be a recession. They're causing it in part. Unemployment's going to go up. He said that. He tied unemployment to killing, basically demand destruction and getting inflation under control. He said, that's how we're going to do it. And you're already starting to see some early signs of that. So with that as their focus, who says the Fed's going to, get a wake-up call? Almost certainly not. I mean, they told us what they're going to do. They're going to raise rates. And then he said, if we see progress on inflation, we'll pause. But pause doesn't mean cut. It means just wait a long time, because at that point, core PCE, that's personal consumption expenditure, core, which excludes oil and food, and that's just how they do it. That's their favorite metric. You can debate whether it's the best one, but the debate doesn't matter because that is the one they use. Let's say that comes down to around 3.5. Okay, it's still not 2. Now, what Powell, which is their target, so what Powell said is, we don't have to keep raising rates to force it to 2. We just have to raise them enough that it'll get to 2 on its own. That's what they call restrictive policy. So, but that's not a rate cut. He said that might last for a year, all the way into 2024. That's when he was talking about rate cuts. Now, again, this can change, but they've told us what they're going to do. I always say, forecasting the Fed's the easiest thing I do, because they actually tell you what you're going to do, what they're going to do. You just have to listen and believe them. Now, the hard part is understanding how badly they're going to destroy the economy and when they're going to get the wake-up call. That's the hard part of the analysis. But telling you what they're going to do is the easy part, because they kind of tell you. So the stock market notion that somehow they'll be cutting rates is just false. But the second fallacy is even bigger. Is tell me why it's a buy signal for stocks if the Fed is throwing the economy into such a bad recession that unemployment is going to go up significantly and growth is going to come down, inflation is going to come down. Why is that a buy signal for stocks? Bear market rallies are really interesting. Some of the biggest rallies in history have been in the middle of bear markets, where you ended up losing everything, but for a couple of days or weeks even, it's hey, the bottom's in, you buy stocks, etc. So you have to watch out for that. So my expectation is the recession's coming. It's going to be really bad. Inflation is going to come down fast, but not quite fast enough for the Fed. They're going to keep raising rates, destroying demand, raising unemployment, and we're going to wake up with a severe recession, high unemployment, and a much lower stock market. I was around for the 2008 financial crisis. I was around for 1998 financial crisis. You know, I negotiated that bailout for LTCM. 98 was interesting because it was an acute financial crisis that came very close, within hours, actually. And I was in the room with the Treasury and Italian Finance Ministry and 19 banks and, a thundering herd of lawyers trying to save the world. But we came within hours of shutting every market in the world. There was a $4 billion all cash, you couldn't use the word due diligence because there wasn't time. It was just, hey, the Fed wants us to do this, so let's just do it. So that worked, but it was a very close call. They would have shut down Tokyo and then around the world, London and finally New York. And they would have opened days later, but that's how, with trillions of dollars of losses, it would have been worse than what actually happened in 2008. It didn't happen. But there was no economic recession at the time. That confuses a lot of people because, and particularly if you're using 2008 as a frame of reference, there are financial panics and financial crises and liquidity crises, and there are recessions, some of which are severe. But they're two different things. 98 was an acute financial crisis with no recession. 2000 was a mild recession, but there was no severe financial crisis. Now, NASDAQ collapsed, but there wasn't a lot of leverage in NASDAQ. There was no contagion there, but it didn't spread because no banks failed, no major brokerages failed, et cetera. So in 1990, a mild recession, but no financial panic. October 19, 1987, interesting, stock market fell 22% in one day. Not a week or a month, but one day, down 22%. And that was a financial crisis, but there was no recession. So they're separate things. However, they can happen together. And 2008 was an example. There we had both. But I would encourage analysts to separate those two things. Again, they came together. It was horrific, but they can happen separately. My point is, we may have a very bad recession, possibly worse than 2008. But 2008 is a model, and that may be what we're heading for, bearing in mind that these are two separate vectors. I'm going to spend $50 billion to create 51% of the mining capacity in the world, and I'm going to steal all the Bitcoin in the world and take down the Western financial system. First of all, there's no such thing as cryptocurrency. There are 1,000 cryptocurrencies. In other words, you cannot speak generically about cryptocurrencies. Jim Rickards hates cryptocurrencies. That's not true. I really, really dislike Bitcoin, and I'll tell you why. But there are cryptocurrencies out there that I think are very interesting and worth your consideration. I'm for it. I'm against it. Cryptocurrency means nothing. You have to talk about the specific currency. And I'm showing Bitcoin, Litecoin, Monero, and Ether. By the way, isn't it fascinating how the graphical representation of cryptocurrencies is always a gold or silver coin? Bitcoin's gold and Litecoin's silver, Monero's both, and Ether is gold. I mean, what are they trying to say? I think that psychologically what they're saying is, well, this is nothing, but if we pretend it's a gold coin, then someone will buy it. But I just find this a little bit of an aside. But no, it's the same thing is true with fiat currencies. You can't be like or dislike fiat currencies generically. Some people do because they just hate central banks. I understand that. But it's a big difference between a Venezuelan Bolivar and a euro, big difference between a Zimbabwe dollar and a US dollar. So in other words, don't talk to me about cryptocurrencies. Tell me what specific one you want to talk about, and that's a more interesting conversation. I think that's really important because this field is so muddied, the conversation is so muddied, people not distinguishing between blockchain and currency, not distinguishing between different types of currencies, et cetera. I think we need to step back, take a deep breath, and be rigorous in our analysis and think about what we're actually talking about. There's no such thing as a blockchain. There are hundreds of blockchains. In other words, every currency, every token, every so-called smart contract, if you're using Ether, has a different blockchain.
So there are at least hundreds, perhaps thousands of blockchains, new ones being created every day. So again, don't talk to me about blockchain. Tell me which specific blockchain you're talking about, because they're not all the same, and this is critical. The main difference, there are many differences in this blockchain technology, but the main difference is validation. Because remember, the whole idea of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the original Bitcoin and what Satoshi Nakamoto came up with is that we're going to have a trustless system. We're not going to trust banks. We're not going to trust clearinghouses. We're not going to trust exchanges. We're not going to trust central banks. We're not going to trust anybody. We're going to have a decentralized system that a community can validate, and we don't have to rely on anybody in particular. That was the original idea. So the question is, what's your method of validation? And that's what distinguishes one blockchain from the other. So I've listed 4 of them here, but there are others. Proof of work, that's what blockchain uses. And you know what the work is? You got to like factor these, 87-digit prime numbers into prime factors. It's a lot of computer crunching, completely clunky, completely inefficient, non-sustainable. I'll talk about that in a second. But that's Bitcoin. There's something else called proof of stake, meaning you actually, this is what Ether is based on. You demonstrate that you have a certain percentage of the processing power, so you step up based on your stake. There's proof of space. Space is storage space on a hard drive, so I get to vote on the blockchain. I get to vote on validating the blockchain because I've decided to devote a certain amount of my hard drive to that process. There's a new coin called Space Mint. And then there's the Byzantine Agreement, or Byzantine Agreement. There's a version of that called the Federated Byzantine Agreement, which I personally think is the best, much more robust to some of the problems we're talking about, and there are others. But the point is, don't talk about blockchain. Say, okay, what's your governance model? What's your validation model, et cetera? And then ask yourself, is that sustainable? Is that robust? Will that resist an attack? Are your cryptocurrencies going to be stolen? These are the questions you have to ask yourself, and there are no generic answers. So I cannot emphasize enough. Coin by coin. I hate to use the word coin, whatever, token by token, blockchain by blockchain. Be rigorous and ask yourself what's sustainable. Now, Bitcoin, Ripple, and Ether, and some of these other cryptocurrencies, not all of them, but the best known are going to fail. When I say fail, they're going to, Bitcoin might have a $200 value as a token for criminals. I think criminals and terrorists might find a use case at about $200 per Bitcoin, but they're basically not going to be anywhere near where they are today. Why do I say that? I don't want to make a claim without backing it up. The first point is they're non-scalable. Transaction times are slow, and then when you say that to Bitcoin people, they go, aha, the Lightning Network is right around the corner. Lightning's going to, we'll see. They said that about segregated witness. They said that about some of these other solutions. They don't seem to get community support. They keep forking the Bitcoin, meaning one day you wake up and there's 2 blockchains instead of 1, or whatever happened to that whole idea that we weren't going to have inflation and we weren't going to pull new cryptos out of thin air. But these solutions, you have to understand what the solution is. So what they're saying is nobody has a solution for the inherent slowness, clunkiness, non-scalability of the original Bitcoin blockchain. There's no solution for that. So when you hear about solutions, what are they? Well, what they're saying is take a bunch of transactions offline. So everybody in the room could form a group, or let's say every coffee shop in Brooklyn, New York, every coffee shop in Vancouver could form a group. And all the people who want to buy coffee would join that group. And we would agree, so we're in our own little bubble over here, and we would agree that all of our Bitcoin transactions among each other don't go on the blockchain. They just get settled in this sort of separate cloud over here, and then we net them out. So, I pay you 5 Bitcoin, and you pay the person next to you 4, and he pays the lady in the back of the room 10, and she pays me 7, and we net it out, and then periodically, and it could be daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever, we net all this stuff out, and then we take that net and we put that on the blockchain, so that the amount of transactions that have to go on the blockchain is greatly reduced. That's true. But what are we doing? We've created our own network. I got to trust the coffee shops. How do I know they're not going to steal my money? In other words, it's only a solution because you're completely negating the original idea. Oh, well, sure. If you want to tear up the original idea and start over,
that's fine, but don't tell me you're adhering to the idea of a decentralized trustless network, because you're not. All you've done is create another network. Somebody, I get trolled on Twitter all the time. People tell me I'm an idiot and I don't know technology and all that stuff. And then my more sour moods, I tell them I was coding before they were born. But as far as some of these things are concerned, somebody said, well, you don't understand payment channels, and I actually do. And I said, yeah, I understand payment channels. We had those in the 50s. They were called party lines, which is, you pick up the phone and someone's talking. You got to ask them to get off the phone so you could go. In other words, there was an AT&T network, at least in the United States, but other people could jump in on this little side thing. That's all it is. These are party lines. So that doesn't work. Non-sustainable. The energy usage to solve the problem and make the proof of work in Bitcoin is now greater than the annual energy output of Ireland. Imagine taking all the electricity used in Ireland in a year, and that's how much we have to use to crunch numbers. By the way, every applied mathematician will tell you that prime factoring is a trivial problem. It's like an uninteresting problem. But it takes a lot of computing power to do it because the numbers are so big and the possibilities are so great. So we're just wasting the entire electrical usage of Ireland. In a few years, it's going to be the entire electrical usage of Japan. Who in this room thinks that governments are going to allow Bitcoin miners to use as much electricity in a year as the entire country of Japan, the third largest economy in the world? That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not very green. It's completely wasteful. In other words, it can't happen. So that's why I say it's non-sustainable. It's going to hit a wall. Non-regulated, I don't have to remind you of all the frauds, new ones popping up every day. It's not just exchanges. How do exchanges work? I want to go to a Bitcoin exchange. Well, you got to go in, you got to open an account, just like Merrill Lynch or Charles Schwab, right? So, or Toronto Dominion. So you give me your name, your address, your social security number, your bank wire information, give them all that information, and then send them dollars. And they say, okay, you got some Bitcoin, here's your confirmation. Really? How do I know you didn't just take my dollars and send me a phony baloney confirmation? How do I know you're not, a Ponzi? You're using new money to pay off the old money. How do I know you're not Bernie Madoff with a computer engineering degree? How do I know you're not a bucket shop? How do I know any of those things? The answer is you don't. So good luck with that. Not to mention Bitcoin whales. They estimate there are 1,000 people who control 40% of the Bitcoin. Now you got millennials buying, 1/100th of a Bitcoin for, $10 or whatever the math is, $100. But you got these, I call them the whales, these 1,000 people who have 40% of all the Bitcoin. You don't think they have a big vested interest in keeping the price up? And you don't think they wash trade, do wash sales? So A sells to B for 10,000, B sells back for 11,000, A sells back for 12,000, B sells back for 13,000. This is called painting the tape. It's the oldest trick in the book. And there's no profit and loss because we're selling the same Bitcoin back and forth. But what we are doing is creating a ticker that gets the millennials, I shouldn't pick up millennials, 3 millennial children, but gets people all over the world, maybe a garage mechanic in South Korea took out a home equity loan or hawked his inventory, put his entire life savings into Bitcoin, and has now been wiped out and is desperate and suicidal. That's what's going on. It's basically rich people stealing from the poor. Not a good business model, in my view. And then finally, there's no use case other than criminals, terrorists, or tax evaders. Why is Bitcoin better than Visa unless you're a criminal? Now, if you're a criminal, I get it. If you're buying child pornography, you want to use the dark web and use some cryptos and all that. And if you try doing that with Visa, you'll probably get a call from the FBI. So I understand why it's good for criminals. But if you're not a criminal, if you're not a tax evader, if you're not buying child pornography, if you're not an arms dealer, if you're not a terrorist, then why is Bitcoin better than Visa? There's really no use case for it other than crime. And then it's non-elastic. And this is important because there's a finite number of Bitcoins, 21 million Bitcoin. They're getting closer to that level every day. And everyone's like, this is a good thing because, the problem with central banks is they print all this money and we're going to have inflation. By the way, we haven't had any inflation for the last 8 years. Separate issue. I'll come to that if we don't run out of time. But, we hate central banks. They print too much money, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to cap the number of Bitcoin. But money supply has to be elastic. It can't be too elastic. The problem with central bank money is that it's too elastic. The reason, by the way, gold is such a good form of money is that it grows slowly. It grows at about the tempo of world growth. It grows at about the tempo of population growth, not exactly, but close enough that it's the best form of money anyone's ever discovered. But the problem with Bitcoin, when you hit a hard stop, which they will, and the economy keeps growing, but you want to back it with Bitcoin, so here's your money supply and here's your economy, that's inherently deflationary, right? Because each Bitcoin's got to support more and more growth, meaning your Bitcoin is worth more in theory, but the problem is you never get there. Why? Because if you have a deflationary currency, there's no bond market. The money supply grows based on credit, based on loans, based on various forms of borrowing. The money supply is just a foundation, and the economy grows with credit. Nobody wants to borrow in a form of money that's going to be more expensive when you pay it back. I'm not talking about interest. That's always part of the equation. But I'm saying the money itself is worth more when you have to pay back the loan. No one's going to borrow on that loan, therefore no bond market, therefore no viable form of money. So these are all the reasons why this is going to hit the wall.
The inflation peaked around 9%, but it has been coming down. It's still too high. It's still way above the Fed's target. They say we want 2%, but I've never felt that 2% was the right target for inflation. I always thought it should be zero. If you believe in price stability, you wouldn't want any inflation and you wouldn't want any deflation. You would want price stability. Now, of course, you're never going to get it exactly there, but the target in that world would be zero, maybe a little bit below, a little bit above, but you'd always be steering to zero. That means you're not stealing anyone's money through inflation. You're not enriching creditors through deflation. You're not distorting the allocation of capital by either one. You're just saying we want stable money. That's kind of the Fed's job. Then the question is, why is it 2%? And, I disagree with Milton Friedman on a lot of things, but Milton Friedman said zero. He didn't think it should be 2%. He thought zero was the right number. I agree with that. So why is it 2%? Well, the Fed has a rationale. The rationale is every now and then you have to cut interest rates to stimulate the economy, bail out the stock market. You just need a rate cut. And the evidence is pretty good that negative rates don't work. They have been tried for years in Japan, Switzerland, I believe Sweden for a while, and the ECB, but they don't do anything. They don't stimulate. In fact, they often do the opposite of what they're intended to do. Let me give you a concrete example. So the idea is if I cut interest rates, lower and lower, as a saver or an investor, I'm going to say, well, I don't like those low yields. I put money in the bank. I only get, a quarter of 1% or half of 1% or whatever. So I'll go buy some treasury notes or I'll go buy some stocks. And that's called the portfolio channel effect. In other words, by keeping rates so low, you make simple savings and liquid investments unattractive, and you drive investors to other investments, housing, stocks, bonds, whatever, commodities perhaps. And then that creates a wealth effect. And if my assets go up, I feel more prosperous, and maybe I spend more money, and that helps the economy, et cetera, et cetera. That's the theory. It's all garbage, by the way. There's very little evidence for the wealth effect. Assets go up, people feel a little better about it, but the idea that they turn around and spend more money does not hold up. The people with the most assets tend to have the most discretionary income. And, once you got a couple of cars and a couple of houses, and a decent wardrobe, you're actually going to go spend more money. Well, probably not. You'll probably save it or invest it. I'm not saying those are bad things, but the idea that it stimulates the economy is not true. But if you follow the theory and say, okay, lower rates force you into asset purchases, et cetera, wouldn't negative rates do even more of that? Because what happens with a negative rate? You have $100,000 in the bank and at a negative 1% interest rate. I'm the government or the treasury or the bank. I'm taking $1,000 a year. I'm taking 1% out of your account. So you're sitting there. You just say, hey, I just want to save $100,000. That's all I want. But with a negative rate, it goes 99, 98, 97. And the idea there is, well, now you're really going to spend your money because it's kind of use it or lose it. Again, these are kind of theories, but let me kind of ground that in the real world a little bit. What do people actually think? When they see negative rates, people say to themselves, there must be deflation coming. The economy must be in really bad shape. Deflation must be getting the upper hand. Why else would they go to negative rates if they weren't worried about deflation? And if they are worried about deflation, and they are, then I'm going to save more. Far from getting people to spend, remember, the dollar is worth more. In a deflationary world, your dollars are actually worth more. In real terms, the dollar can be just a bank account, can be your best performing investment. In a deflationary world, if you have 2% deflation, then the real value of a savings account with zero interest goes up 2%. And that's probably better than what stocks are doing in that world. So people act rationally. They say, okay, we have negative rates. Central bank must be worried about deflation. If they're worried, I'm worried. And I'm going to save more because, first of all, those savings will do well in deflation. I need to be prepared for that. The last thing I want to do is spend. If prices are going down, why would I spend? I'll wait 6 months, get a cheaper price. So in other words, real world behavior is the exact opposite of what central bankers predict. Central bankers predict, use it or lose it, you'll go spend the money because I'm going to take it away. But real people say, no, I'm going to save more because you're signaling to me that the value of the money is going up because you're worried about deflation. The prices are coming down, so what's the rush? So for all those reasons, negative rates don't work. Now, in theory, cutting rates from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 down to 0 does perhaps have some stimulative effect, not as much as people think. And so the Fed says, well, we don't want to start with 0. If we start with 0, if that's our target, and negative doesn't work, and the economy goes into a recession, how do we stimulate the economy? We can't go below 0, but we can't cut rates because we're at 0. So they believe that they ought to keep rates around 2%. Now, as inflation is about 2%, interest rates are about 2%. And that gives you 2 points of cuts. You could do in 25 basis point rate cuts, you could do 8 cuts. It's a full year of rate cuts from 2 to 1 3/4, 1.5, 1 1/4, et cetera. You could do 8 25 basis point rate cuts with 2%. So the Fed says our target rate is 2% because we need a little cushion in case we have to cut. And if we're at 0, we don't have a cushion, we can't cut. That's what they say. The reality is the following. And the way I explain this, it's like a little kid, like a 9-year-old kid, and his mother leaves her purse around. And the kid goes in the purse and sees there's $50 in the purse. And he says, well, even an 8-year-old will say, well, if I steal the $50, mom's going to catch me and I'm going to be in trouble. But if I take a couple bucks, she won't notice. Like, she's not counting the dollars every day. And the Fed's idea is if I steal 2% from you, you won't notice. 10%, yeah, you'll be up in arms. You'll be driving tractors up the steps of the Fed the way they did in 1980. But 2%, you kind of won't notice. Well, what's the math of 2%? Well, 2% cuts the value of the dollar in half in 35 years. It cuts it in half again in another 35 years. Bear in mind, you're starting from down half. So in a typical lifetime of 70 years, at 2%, the dollar is going to lose 75% of its purchasing power. So in 70 years, typical lifetime, your dollar loses 75% of its purchasing power at 2%. And that's really the point. Because 2% year in, year out, probably not enough to feel, but it's insidious. And by doing it for a long enough period of time, you destroy the purchasing power of the dollar. And that's what they really want to do. Why? Because the federal debt is nominal. The debt is nominal. If I owe you $1, I owe you $1. Whether in real terms it's $1.05 or 95 cents, that's separate, but I owe you the buck. Well, if you can destroy the purchasing power of the dollar, you're actually reducing the real value of the debt. People say America has never defaulted on its debt. Well, first of all, that's not true. It's not a true statement. But the easiest, quietest, stealthiest way to default is inflation. It's like, hey, here's your $1 billion back. Good luck buying a loaf of bread because I destroyed the value of the dollar. Now, 3% will do it in about 23 years, which means that you'll destroy 75% of the purchasing power in 46 years, not 70 years. So on, 4%, 5%, et cetera. At 10%, you cut the value of the dollar in half in 7 years. People like to bang the table and say, since the creation of the Fed in 1913, the dollar has lost 95% of its purchasing power. Well, that's a true statement, but you don't need 110 years. We lost 50% in 5 years. Between 1977 and 1982. So inflation is insidious. It is a tax. It is a form of theft. But like the kid with the mother's wallet, if you keep the theft, in small little bites, but do it long enough, you can get the whole thing and no one will notice. So they say we want 2% because we want to be able to cut if we have to. But the real reason is we want to basically erode the value of the debt and erode the purchasing power of the dollar in ways that you don't notice. And they can be very patient. That's how they do it.
I can tell you exactly what the Fed's going to do, and you can do this at home. So if listeners want to take notes, it's really easy. First of all, what is the problem the Fed's trying to solve? What is their solution? And then what are the exceptions to that so that we can have a complete predictive analytic model? The problem they're trying to solve is the following. We know from a long series of experiences, 30 or more business cycles since the end of World War II, that when the U.S. is in a recession, you have to cut interest rates 3 to 4% to get the U.S. out of a recession. You need 300 to 400 basis points of cuts to get the U.S. It's like a plane heading for the ground. How do you pull it out of a nosedive and get it back up in the sky? The answer is 300 basis points of cuts. How do you cut interest rates 300 basis points when you're only at 75 basis points? The answer is you can't. And forget about negative rates. The evidence is now pretty good that negative rates do not work. In other words, negative rates are not more of the same. When you go from, let's say, 0.5%, then you go to 1/4, and then you go to 0, and then you keep going to negative 25, you didn't just ease by another 25 basis points. The evidence from Japan and Europe is that you're through the looking glass and you have very strange effects, really unintended consequences. I'll give you a couple examples. So the conventional theory is, well, the more I cut interest rates, the more stimulus I get. That's a joke, but that's what they think. But if I go negative, you're absolutely going to go out and spend the money. Because if you don't spend the money, I'm going to take it away. You sit there long enough, you'll have nothing left in your bank account because I'm going to take, with these negative interest rates, I'm going to take it away. So people will run out and spend. And the other thing is that, it's obviously, from the lending point of view, they'll borrow money, because the bank pays you to be a borrower. But here's what happens in the real world. This is the difference between academics and human beings. When people see negative interest rates, people have goals in mind. They have lifetime goals, right? They want kids' education, parents' health care, their own health care, retirement. If you start taking their money away with negative rates, guess what they do? They save more. They're like, hey, I got to put my kids through college. You're taking my money away. I better save more. And then what kind of signal is the central bank sending with negative interest rates? They're sending a deflationary signal. So people go, well, if you think it's going to be deflation, I'm not going to spend money. I'll wait till the price comes down. So you're trying to encourage lending and spending. And what you get is more savings and no spending, deferred spending. You get the exact opposite of what you want. So again, another egghead experiment gone awry. But the point being, so negative rates don't work. So zero bound really is zero. It really is a boundary. And Bernanke has said this in his recent writings, and I think he's right about that. So back to the problem. How do you cut interest rates 300 basis points when you're at 75? Well, the answer is you can't. So you have to raise them to 300 basis points. So the problem the Fed is trying to solve is how do they get rates to 3.25% before the next recession? Now, I'm not saying the Fed sees a recession, and that's easy because the Fed never sees a recession. In 102 years, the Fed has never seen a recession, never forecast a recession. But they know their economic history. We are 8 years into an expansion. It feels punk. I mean, the growth is anemic, but labor force participation is low, productivity is dropping. There are a lot of bad things going on, but in fact, we are in the 8th year, actually coming up on soon be entering the 9th year of an expansion, which began in June 2009. Right. By the way, you have a hard time convincing most Americans that we're not still in a recession. Depressions are different than recessions. The technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP with rising unemployment, a couple other bells and whistles, little subjective factors, but that's basically it. So people, when you say depression, they're like, depression sounds worse than a recession. And if recession is 2 quarters of declining GDP, then a depression must be like 10 quarters of declining GDP because it's got to be worse. But that's not the definition. The definition of a depression, you can have growth in a depression, but it's below trend growth. In other words, if trend is 3.5, and you're actually banging out 1.5, 2, that gap between, let's say, 1.5 and 3.5% growth, that's depressed growth. It's an output gap. It compounds over time, and you never get it back. We are losing trillions of dollars of wealth. We are impoverishing future generations on a relative basis because of our inability to get back to trend growth. So the reason American people feel this and don't listen to the economists, and they're right, is because we're in a depression. So leaving that aside, the Fed at least understands the business cycle and the fact that the next recession, they say they don't die of old age, but they do die, and we're getting closer to the next one. So they are in a desperate race to get rates up to 3.5% before the next recession hits so they can cut them to get out of the recession. The question is, can you raise rates enough to cure the next recession without causing the recession you're preparing to cure? That's the dilemma. That's the finesse. My answer is no, they're not going to be able to do it, but they think they can. Why are they in this box? Well, because Bernanke should have raised rates in 2010, 2011, in the early stages of the expansion, when the economy would have been much better able to bear it than it is now. Bernanke skipped a whole cycle. He skipped a whole rate increase cycle to pursue these wacky experiments and, QE and zero interest rate policy and all that. I spoke to Bernanke about this, and he used the word experiment. He said this was an experiment. Bernanke made his academic reputation by studying the Great Depression, in the wake of Friedman and Anna Schwartz and some others. But he was a great scholar of the Great Depression, and he got his chance to kind of try out his theories. But what he told me was, he said, 30 years from now, some new Ben Bernanke, some young scholar, will look back and tell us if we did a good job or not. We actually don't know right now. See, the Great Depression was really two technical recessions, 29 to 33, and then 1937, 38. But from 33 to 37, we had an expansion, but the whole thing was a depression because we never got out of it. The stock market recovered the 1929 high in 1954. It was a long time to get back to even. But Bernanke's mantra was, doing something is better than doing nothing. I completely disagree. It's better to do nothing if you don't know what you're doing. And this is really the monetary equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors say, first rule of being a doctor is first do no harm. Anyway, bottom line is, by pursuing QE and zero interest rate policy, Bernanke failed to raise rates during the early stages of a cyclical expansion, which he should have done. If he had, the economy would have been just fine, and we'd be able to cut them today, but he didn't. So Janet Yellen now has to make up for lost time. So that's the mission. But again, and this is what the market completely does not get, and the Wall Street economists don't get. Nobody gets this, because they see the Fed raising rates, and they've done the correlations and the regressions back to World War II, and they go, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. So if the Fed's raising rates, the economy must be getting stronger, so bid up stock prices, et cetera. But that's like saying umbrellas cause rain. Because they've got the causality backwards. The Fed never leads the economy, ever. The Fed follows the economy. So a normal business cycle looks like this. So you get a little expansion going, and unemployment starts to go down, and industrial capacity utilization starts to go up, and inflation starts to go up, and the Fed's watching, and then it keeps going, and they go, it's getting a little hot, we better raise rates, and they raise rates, but of course they started too late. The expansion keeps going, inflation keeps going up, unemployment keeps going down. Then the economy starts to cool down, unemployment goes up, and then prices go down, and capacity utilization drops, and we get into recession, we better cut. And then they cut, and then you hit the bottom, and then you come out of it again. So think of that as like a nice, pretty sine wave, right? That's a business expansion, business contraction over and over, 30 or so times since the end of World War II, with the Fed always following the economy, never leading the economy. So all the big brains on Wall Street, they've got all this data, and they say, well, every time the Fed raises rates, the economy is getting stronger. That has absolutely been true for 30 times since the end of World War II. It is not true today. The reason it's not true today is because Bernanke skipped a cycle, and they're playing catch up. For the first time since 1937, the Fed is tightening into weakness. That's a key thing to bear in mind. The Fed is tightening into weakness. They are not leading the economy to strength. They are not responding to strength, even though Wall Street thinks they are. And there's a great danger that they're actually going to cause the recession they're preparing to cure, as I mentioned. The Fed will raise rates 25 basis points 4 times a year from now until the middle of 2019, until they get them to 3.25%. So like clockwork, every March, June, September, December, for 2017, 2018, into 2019, look for a Fed rate hike until they get to 3.25%, at which point they'll be able to say, all right, now we're 3.25. If we have a recession tomorrow, we can cut them back down to 0 again and get out of it. That'll be mission accomplished. Now, this is why I was sitting there in December yep, they're going to raise them in March. And right now, I'll tell your listeners they're going to raise them in June. There's your Fed response function. There's your baseline scenario. What are the exceptions to Fed rate hike? Under what conditions will they not raise rates? Because everything I just described to you, they've had in mind since March 2015, when Yellen took patience out of the statement. That was the end of forward guidance. And by the way, if you go back to 2015, I said they're not going to raise rates all year, and they weren't going to do the liftoff that people were looking for in March, June, September, and they didn't lift off in September because the Chinese rate exchange devaluation, the stock market fell out of bed August 2015. Finally, they raised them in December 2015, and Wall Street was ready for March. I said, no. In June, no. September, no. It wasn't until December 2016 that they raised them the second time. So obviously, there are conditions under which they don't raise rates, notwithstanding the baseline scenario. So what are those conditions? There are 3. Well, 4, actually. So if you see job creation below 75,000, that will cause them to pause. By the way, pause is the key word. If you go home through the speeches, you'll see the word pause in Dudley's recent remarks. Pause is the Fed's jargon for we're not going to raise rates. We got the Jim scenario, which I took from the Fed. It's their scenario, or a technical recession. So, we're going to know Friday what the first quarter GDP is. It's pretty close to negative, but I'm not saying we're in a recession now. We might be. But if you see a recession, they'll pause. See job creation below 75,000, they'll pause. By the way, that's a very low bar. If you see a jobs report, see, this is the other thing that confuses Wall Street. You see a jobs report with 100,000 jobs. So Wall Street goes, oh, that report's really weak. The Fed's going to think twice. No, 75,000 is the number. Yellen told us that. It was in one of her speeches. You just have to be a geek like me and read all the speeches. So the third factor would be disinflation. So the Fed has this 2% inflation target. They missed it for 6 years. They're finally getting close to hitting it. By the way, I think the listeners know they use the PCE core deflator year over year. There's PPI and CPI and core, a bunch of inflation indices, but we know what they use. PCE core deflator year over year. That actually has been getting close to 2%. But if you see it turn around, if you see that gap down to like 1.5, 1.4, 1.3, then they will pause. The last condition for the pause is a disorderly decline in stock markets more than 5%. If you see a 6, 7, 8% decline, so if the S&P went down 100 points, Fed doesn't care. Dow Jones goes down 1,000 points, Fed doesn't care. But beyond that, if you see the S&P start to go down 150 or the Dow start to go down 1,500 points in a disorderly way, it looks a little scary. It looks like there's no bottom. It looks like if you see that, they'll pause. So the Fed's going to raise like clockwork 4 times a year for the next 2.5 years, unless you see job creation below 75,000, disinflation, a technical recession. If you don't see one of those things, they're going to raise rates. And so right now, I don't see any of them. I mean, they could all happen, but it looks like, growth is going to be positive. Job creation's been decent, over 100,000. Disinflation is probably coming, but not quite here yet. And they'll want to see a couple months in a row. And the stock market's not crashing. So none of the pause conditions are in place. Therefore, they will raise rates. Simple. If you look at yield curves, look at the Treasury yield curve, Euro-dollar futures yield curve, German Bunds yield curve, they're all inverted. They're all inverted. Now, inversions happen, just meaning the longer-term rate is lower than the short-term rate. We're seeing something globally we've never seen before, and it is the best single indicator of a recession. The last time we saw anything like this was in 2007, just ahead of the 2008 financial catastrophe. So the stock market's saying it's all good, Goldilocks, soft landing, Fed's going to get the memo, they're going to cut rates, the pivot, and buy stocks. The bond market is saying, no, this is bad, and it's going to get worse, and it's actually too late for the Fed to do anything about it. See, when these inversions start, sometimes they're a year forward, like, hey, look at the Euro-dollar futures yield curve a year from now, man, that thing is inverted. But what happens is, as you get closer to the actual thing you're worried about, the inversion gets nearer and nearer. Now it is literally a month away or less. So that's like a big red siren, flashing light, whatever you want to call it. Okay, whatever your baseline is, probably treasuries, 2-year notes or 5-year notes or whatever, they will come down a lot. Not right away. We may still be a month or two away on this, but they'll come down a lot. And then corporate yields will go up a lot because of the recession, because of deterioration, increased bankruptcies, reduced revenues, et cetera. So those spreads will blow out. And it's important to remember, interest rates are a lagging indicator. Everyone's like, well, how could interest rates be going up if we're in a recession? The answer is, as you get closer to recession, who figures it out first? Well, the Fed figures it out last. They're usually the last to know. Wall Street is second last to know. The people who figure it out first are actual business people, entrepreneurs, restaurant owners, dry cleaners, taxi drivers, or even medium-sized businesses. They see it. If you're in the trucking business, it's real time. If inventories are sky high and new orders are being slashed, you're not moving anything by truck. So there are certain businesses that are concurrent. The yield curves I was talking about are very good forward indicators. They tell you what's going to happen next. A lot of business people are living in the real world in real time. They know what's happening now.
and the stock market tends to figure it out later. But as far as banking and credit is concerned, what happens is if you're a business person and you see business heading down, fewer customers, whatever, you go out and borrow all you can. You're like, hey, there's a really bad recession coming. If I got lines of credit, I'm going to use them up now. I don't want my bank changing the terms. I said, I'm going to borrow everything I can. And that creates a demand for funds and interest rates go up. And then the recession hits and the bankers go, what's going on? Credit losses start going up. And then they just turn off the spigots and they raise standards, they stop doing loans, and then interest rates will start to come down. Interest rates peak after the recession has already begun. So interest rates may not have peaked yet. Even the treasury market. So that's not unusual. Now, here's what the Fed is missing, or maybe everybody's missing. When you hear these layoff announcements, people are like, well, if they're laying off, why isn't the unemployment rate going up? Well, the answer is they have to announce the layoffs. There's all kinds of statute, SEC. So if I'm going to fire 10,000 people, I got to tell the world I'm firing 10,000 people. It doesn't mean I fire them that day. I might fire them on a rolling basis over the next 30 days. And it doesn't mean they walk out the door empty-handed and head for the unemployment office. I might give them 3 months severance, 6 months severance, et cetera. And so when do they actually show up to the unemployment office and say, give me a check? It might not be till this spring. So the layoff announcements are out there, but the unemployment rate hasn't budged because there is a lag, 3 months. But that's why I said interest rates lag the business cycle, and they do. Unemployment lags the business cycle. Unemployment is a lagging indicator. When you're an employer, entrepreneur, and you're in any kind of distress, not as many customers walking in the door, you'll do everything you can to avoid laying people off. You'll, be late on the rent. You'll turn down the lights, find a cheaper laundry, whatever it takes. By the time you get around to firing people, you run out of options. Like, I've done everything I can. Now my business is in jeopardy. I have to fire some people. And then combine that with what I just said about severance and, rolling terminations, et cetera. It's a lagging indicator. But we know enough right now to know that number's going up. But that's not inconsistent with the fact that we're already in a recession. It's exactly what you would expect, that unemployment's a lagging indicator. So when the Fed's on a mission, they actually don't care about the stock market. Here's what they do care about. They care about disorderly markets. And that's the key word. It's not, if stocks are going down, but it's, kind of a little, 0.5% a day, 1% a day, trending down, lower highs, lower lows, trending down. The Fed doesn't care about that. They're not going to bail out the stock market. They do care if it's disorderly. When was it disorderly? Well, March 2020, at the worst part of the pandemic. It dropped like 30% in like 2 or 3 weeks. The fall of 2008, it was like somebody opened a trap door. The Fed does care about that because that kind of disorderly behavior can feed on itself and end up in a 1929 type scenario. So the Fed will get the memo, as I put it, stop raising rates and begin cuts when the markets are disorderly. That may happen. In fact, I expect it will, but we're not there yet. So there may be a pivot, but not because of Goldilocks, but because it's not a soft landing, it's a crash landing. So the global economy is in bad shape. It's going into a recession. Now, a lot of people have said that, we're going to have a recession as if it's no big deal, but they're expecting a mild recession. I see a much more severe recession. Now, the other half, what does this mean for financial markets? And there, the best way I've been able to explain it, imagine you're in an Irish pub and you got 3 Irish storytellers. And I'm part Irish, so I can talk about the Irish, but they're telling 3 different stories, and you got to listen to each one. So there's the Fed story, the market story, and then there's something called reality, what's actually happening. So stock market's telling us Goldilocks, bond market's telling us, here comes, Hurricane Mitch or whatever. And then there's what I call the reality. And I guess I'm the storyteller here, but what I see is a kind of a hybrid. The Fed's doing what they're doing, right or wrong. Okay, they're doing what they're doing. The market has their own interpretation. I agree with the market, certainly the bond market, that the Fed has probably over-tightened, and they may pivot. To say that there could be a rate cut, maybe, I wouldn't rule that out, but for a really bad reason. In other words, if the Fed cuts rates, which they may, the pivot may be real, it's not because they engineered a soft landing and Goldilocks and everything. Oh, that's just right. It's because they screwed up as usual, as they've been doing since 1913. They over tightened and they found out too late. And then they have to slam on the brakes or take the foot off the brake, if you will, in terms of rate hikes, and then pivot. And we've seen this movie before. This is exactly what happened in 2018. The stock market dropped 20%. I mean, it's like 19.9 or something on the Dow, so maybe not technically a bear market, but yeah, what's the difference? It dropped 20%. The Fed was tightening into that collapse. The Fed tightened on December 16th, 2018, only like 8 days before the Christmas Eve massacre. And after most of the 20% collapse had already happened, they tightened one last time. So what it shows you is that when the Fed's on a mission, they actually don't care about the stock market, this whole, Bernanke put and Greenspan put and all that. That's not how it works. They don't care that much about the stock market level. But a global recession is highly unusual, and that appears to be what we're heading for. So my forecast, I do update them, but big picture, it goes as follows. So what is Jay Powell doing? First of all, March 1st, 2022, the Fed fund policy rate, interest rates were 0. And we're now at 4.5%. Even in the Volcker days, we never went up 4.5% in 10 months. Not that fast. And so here we are. So what is Powell doing? Well, he's given 5 speeches on the subject. I don't know why Wall Street doesn't listen, but he keeps trying. He said the same thing every time. He said, inflation is job one. We're just going after inflation. Believe us. There is going to be a recession. Unemployment is going to go up. There's going to be pain. I've never heard a Fed chairman use the word pain. He used it 5 times in one paragraph in the Jackson Hole speech. And that's what we're doing. And believe us when we say it. Now, how long will he raise rates? How quickly? And what's he trying to do? Powell is trying to get to something that he calls the terminal rate. The definition of the terminal rate is it's a rate that's high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further hikes. So we'll get to a level, and then inflation is coming down, by the way. And in the last 5 months, in the U.S., it's gone from about 9% to 8.7, 8.2, 7.4, 7.1. So it is coming down. Having said that, the target is 2%, and 7.1 is still a far cry from 2. So he's not there, but he's making progress. Now, so here's I hate to use the word conundrum, but it kind of is. Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are two different things. And right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So my expectation is the Fed will raise interest rates 50 basis points on February 1st, and then probably 25 basis points in March. March 22nd is the Fed meeting after that. So those 75 plus the 450 we have now, that'll get you to 5.25. And even the more hawkish members think that that's probably the terminal rate. So, so Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation's coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message. Why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, he said this in his last book, just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist, he's a lawyer, so he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question, so that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't. If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing. And that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up and, people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed. And energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral.
And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. You know, the old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, because people can't afford it. Like, you know, maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons.